The Petals at Rosewood Garden by Catherine Walton. Chapter 1. The Scent of Celebration. The golden glow of morning bathed Rosewood Garden in warm, buttery light. Dew still clung to the petals of the heirloom roses, and the air shimmered with promise. Helen Lighthall's Subaru rattled gently over the gravel path that wound through the eastern entrance of the sprawling estate. She eased to a stop beneath a flowering jacaranda, purple blossoms raining down like slow confetti. In the back seat, Halo popped up with a soft bark. Shadow, ever the stoic one, remained curled at Helen's side, black eyes watchful. "All right, boys," Helen said, reaching for the reusable bag at her feet. "We're here to admire the roses, not to trample them." The car door creaked open. The scent of the garden hit her at once, earthy and fragrant, with undercurrents of cut grass, citrus blossoms, and something distinctly antique, like old paper and time-worn leather. Helen took a long breath and smiled. Rosewood Garden was celebrating its centennial with a week-long festival, complete with floral design competitions, archive exhibits, and live demonstrations. Helen hadn't planned to attend until Ivy Radley, the current director and an old acquaintance, sent a handwritten invitation tucked inside a pressed flower card. The event was meant to celebrate the past, but as with all things old and storied, Helen suspected the garden had a few secrets yet to bloom. She clipped leashes to Halo and Shadow and set off toward the conservatory. The towering glass dome glinted like a crown above a tapestry of pathways, box hedges, and rose-draped pergolas. Volunteers in matching green aprons bustled between booths, carrying bundles of signage, floral wire, and neatly folded programs. As she walked, Helen noticed the careful choreography of the preparation. This wasn't just a garden festival, it was a statement. Every detail had been orchestrated to showcase Rosewood's prestigious heritage. The temporary pavilions were positioned to highlight the garden's most photogenic angles, and even the volunteers moved with practiced precision, as if they'd rehearsed these movements for weeks. "Helen." Ivy Radley emerged from behind a flower cart, her auburn curls pinned under a wide-brimmed hat and her arms loaded with clipboards. She looked only mildly harried, which Helen considered a triumph, given Ivy's usual flair for chaos. "Just in time," Ivy said, breathless. "Judging starts in 2 hours. Clarice is already throwing daggers with her eyes, and Gerald's gone on one of his disappearing walks again." Helen arched a brow. "Clarice Moore? The floral prodigy?" "She insists on being called a botanical sculptor now. And she's been asking pointed questions about our archive access policies." Ivy's voice carried a note of tension Helen hadn't heard before. "Apparently, she's researching her grandmother's work here in the 80s. Claims there are gaps in the official records." "And Gerald?" "He's the groundskeeper/garden historian, retired twice, refuses to leave, swears the roses talk to him." Ivy paused, lowering her voice. "Lately, he's been muttering about inconsistencies in the plant registries. Says someone's been tidying up the historical records." Helen's interest sharpened. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Varieties that should be extinct but aren't. Registration dates that don't match the original greenhouse logs. Gerald thinks someone's been covering tracks." Ivy adjusted her clipboard nervously. "Honestly, I'm starting to wonder if age is catching up with him. But his memory for details is still sharper than anyone's." Helen laughed, though something in Ivy's tone suggested this wasn't entirely amusing. "Sounds like my kind of man." Ivy led the way across the central lawn, pointing out key installations along the way. On the right, a dramatic floral arch composed of deep violet peonies framed a photo booth station. To the left, a minimalist display of all-white calla lilies stood beneath a Future of Rosewood sign. Volunteers hurriedly added signage and QR codes. "The festival's been 3 years in planning," Ivy explained as they walked. "We wanted something that honored both tradition and innovation. Hence the mix of historical exhibits and contemporary design competitions." Helen noted the subtle tensions beneath the surface. Volunteers whispered in small clusters, their conversations dying when Ivy approached. There was an undercurrent of nervous energy that seemed at odds with the celebratory atmosphere. Clarice Moore stood at the edge of the competition tent, her sculptural centerpiece veiled under a gauzy sheet. Her hair was slicked into a sharp black bob, and her lipstick matched the crimson orchids coiled around her wrist. She adjusted the folds of her pristine white jumpsuit and gave Ivy a brief nod, eyes sliding coolly to Helen. "Your dogs won't be near the entries, I assume?" Clarice's voice was crisp, professional, but carried an undertone of suspicion. "Only if they're acting as judges," Helen said lightly. Clarice's smile was sharp as her pruning shears. "I take my work seriously, Ms. Lighthall. This competition represents more than personal achievement. It's about artistic legacy and historical accuracy." She gestured toward her veiled sculpture. "My piece draws inspiration from my grandmother's botanical research, work that was unfortunately overlooked during certain periods of Rosewood's history." Ivy shifted uncomfortably. "Clarice has been very dedicated to her family's connection to the garden." "Dedicated to uncovering the truth," Clarice corrected, her gaze fixed on Ivy. "Some stories deserve to be told, don't they?" She turned with a swish, dismissing them like garden pests. "Still charming," Ivy muttered as they walked away. "She's been increasingly confrontational about access to the sealed archives. Keeps insisting there's documentation about her grandmother's hybrid work that should be public." They passed under the rose trellis and entered the shade of the conservatory. Inside, the temperature shifted to a soft, humid warmth. Ferns unfurled like ancient scrolls, and orchids clung to iron railings, blooming in careful, curated chaos. Helen let the moment wash over her. The air was heavy with the scent of history, floral but also faintly metallic. She blinked, noting how the morning light created complex shadows among the plantings. "What's that smell?" "Probably the cleaning solvent," Ivy said. "We had a minor incident yesterday. Gerald knocked over a tray of tools, swore someone moved his cart." She hesitated. "He's been paranoid lately. Claims someone's been in the tool shed after hours moving things around." "Anyone else have access?" "Technically. Only Gerald and Margot Avery, the archive manager. But she keeps to herself these days. Plus, the security guards do night rounds." "Why does Margot keep to herself?" Ivy hesitated, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Let's just say Margot was part of the old guard. Things were different before she stepped down from the hybrid registry board. There was an incident in the late 80s. A fire destroyed part of the experimental greenhouse, and some valuable research was lost. Margot took responsibility, even though most people thought it wasn't entirely her fault." "What kind of incident?" "Nobody talks about it much. Official reports say electrical failure, but Gerald always suspected there was more to it. The timing was convenient for certain board members who wanted to shut down some of the more experimental breeding programs." They emerged from the conservatory and headed toward the archive building, a low stone structure nestled beside the eastern greenhouse. Ivy gestured to the small garden beyond, where rose bushes grew in square plots, each labeled with aged bronze tags. "That's the heirloom trial garden," Ivy said. "Some of the hybrids go back 4 generations. Gerald maintains detailed records of every plant, cross-references them with the original breeding logs." One tag caught Helen's eye. "Queen's Sorrow, 1987. Status, extinct." "I thought this variety was lost?" Helen asked, studying the vigorous bush with its unusual silvery pink blooms. "It was, or it should have been," Ivy said, her voice dropping. "There was a fire in 87, wiped out the greenhouse and everything in it. At least, that's what the official records say." Helen crouched down. The rosebush was anything but extinct. It was thriving, with several full blooms opened and more buds preparing to flower. The petals had an unusual quality, almost luminescent in the morning light. "This isn't extinct," she said quietly. "In fact, it looks like it's been carefully maintained." "I've been wondering the same thing," Ivy admitted. "But it's not officially on the current registry, and Gerald insists it's always been there. When I pressed him about it last week, he got defensive, said some things are better left undisturbed. Helen looked at the tag again. A fresh scratch marred the engraving near the date, and the metal around the edges looked newly cleaned, as if someone had been maintaining it recently. Has Clarice been near this plot? She's been sniffing around, yes. Claims her grandmother worked with this cultivar. She even brought old photographs and what she says are original notes. Gerald examined them and went pale as moonlight. What was in the notes? I couldn't see clearly, but there were chemical formulas, breeding charts, and what looked like toxicology warnings. Gerald confiscated them, said they needed to be properly evaluated before anyone drew conclusions. They returned to the central lawn just as a bell rang from the judging tent. Ivy excused herself to wrangle the volunteers, and Helen turned to scan the rows of chairs. A man in a tailored navy suit stood off to one side, holding court with a group of local officials. His presence seemed to command attention, not through volume, but through an air of assured authority. Victor Bellamy. His silver hair gleamed, and his smile had the perfect weight of practiced charm. Helen recognized him from the news. Real estate developer, philanthropic donor, and, according to local gossip, a man who very much wanted to rezone part of Rosewood for luxury villas. What the gossip columns didn't mention was his extensive investment portfolio in botanical research facilities. He caught her gaze and tipped an invisible hat, excusing himself from his conversation to approach. "Ms. Lighthall, isn't it? The woman who solves things?" His voice was smooth, cultured, with just the right amount of warmth to seem genuine. "Depends on what needs solving," Helen said evenly. Victor chuckled, but his eyes remained calculating. "I hope you won't be solving anything dramatic this week. Wouldn't want bad press at a legacy event, especially not with so many potential investors and city council members in attendance." "Neither would a murderer," she said with a polite smile. Victor blinked, then laughed as if she were joking, though his laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. "You have quite the imagination, Ms. Lighthall. I'm sure this week will be perfectly peaceful. After all, gardens are places of growth and beauty, not conflict." He paused, studying her face. "Though I understand you have a talent for uncovering things that others prefer to keep buried." Helen moved on, but something in his confidence rubbed her wrong. His charm had the shimmer of cheap foil, pleasant from a distance but thin under scrutiny. And his knowledge of her reputation seemed too detailed for casual recognition. As she approached the refreshment tent, Shadow tugged at his leash with unusual insistence. Helen followed his nose to the back of the service area. There, just behind the compost bins, stood a solitary figure hunched over a ledger, muttering quietly to himself. "Gerald Booth," Helen said, smiling as she approached. The old man turned, blinking in the shade. His hat sat low on his brow, and his knuckles were streaked with soil. He had the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades working with earth and growing things, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Miss Lighthall, figured I'd meet you eventually." His voice carried a gravelly warmth. "Ivy mentioned you might be coming, said you had a way of seeing through pretty facades to the rot underneath." Shadow sniffed his boot, then sat with approval. "I hear you're the last line of defense for this place," Helen said. Gerald chuckled, but there was tension in his shoulders. "Some say that. Others say I'm just the ghost that won't quit. Lately I've been feeling more like a man standing guard over a graveyard." Helen crouched beside him, noting the careful annotations in his ledger. "What are you working on?" "Trying to match the current plant tags with the original trial maps," he said, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Some don't line up. Others shouldn't be there at all. And a few—" He glanced around nervously. "A few plants that died in 1987 are somehow thriving today. Like Queen Sorrow?" Gerald's eyes narrowed, and he closed the ledger protectively. "Shouldn't be alive, but it is. Someone's been keeping it alive quietly, and I think I know who." He tapped the ledger against his knee. "But before I tell anyone, I want to find the proof. The real plot maps. The ones that show what actually burned and what was saved." Helen studied his weathered face. You don't trust the official records? Official records get rewritten when history's inconvenient, he said bitterly. I've seen it happen before. Files disappear, dates change, whole experiments get erased because they're embarrassing or expensive. He folded the page carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. The thing is, Miss Lighthall, Queen's Sorrow wasn't just any hybrid. It was special, resistant to disease, incredible blooms, but... He lowered his voice further. It had properties that made certain people nervous. What kind of properties? The kind that could make someone very sick if they weren't careful. The kind that, in the wrong hands, could be dangerous. Then he looked around, lowered his voice, and added, There's something else. Someone was in the archive 2 nights ago. Left the door ajar. I found a rose tag inside, same petal color as Queen's Sorrow, but I never logged that plant and it's not on any official registry. Helen straightened. Where is the tag now? Gerald hesitated, his gaze darting toward the conservatory. I've hidden it. If something happens to me, check the old fountain in the east wing, bottom basin under the stone frog. But be careful who you trust, Miss Lighthall. This garden has more secrets than roses, and some people would kill to keep them buried. Gerald, but he waved her off. I've been walking this garden longer than some folks have been alive. I know when something's growing wrong, and something's been growing very wrong lately. Before Helen could press him further, a loudspeaker crackled to life. The opening ceremony was about to begin. Gerald tipped his hat and shouldered his ledger. Time to smile for the donors. But Miss Lighthall, keep your eyes open. Beautiful things can be the most dangerous of all. He shuffled toward the lawn, leaving Helen standing among the compost bins with more questions than answers. She remained where she was, one hand lightly on Shadow's head. The air smelled of roses and tension, and somewhere beneath the surface of all that curated beauty, something rotten was starting to bloom. Chapter 2. The Petal in the Mouth. The first full day of the Rosewood Centennial Festival dawned bright and crisp, with a crystalline quality to the air that made every color seem more vivid. A delicate breeze carried the scent of rosehips and lavender through the garden as volunteers bustled about, hanging signage, arranging pastries on tiered trays, and polishing last-minute displays. Helen was sipping chamomile tea on a bench just off the east lawn, while Halo and Shadow lay dozing at her feet. The moment felt calm, even peaceful, until she noticed the unusual stillness in the conservatory. Helen had been watching the glass structure from her bench, noting the regular flow of visitors in and out of the building. But for the past 20 minutes, no one had emerged. The morning light slanted through the glass panels, creating geometric patterns on the gravel path, but something felt wrong about the silence. She rose from the bench, teacup still in hand, and approached the conservatory entrance. The heavy glass door stood slightly ajar, unusual, since the climate-controlled environment was normally kept sealed. A faint chemical smell drifted out, sharp and medicinal beneath the expected floral fragrances. "Hello?" Helen called softly, pushing the door open wider. No response. Shadow's ears pricked forward and he let out a low whine. Halo's tail stopped wagging. Helen stepped inside, immediately noticing the temperature difference. Cooler than it should be, as if the climate control had malfunctioned. The humid air that usually enveloped visitors was replaced by something thinner, less welcoming. And then she saw him. Gerald Booth lay crumpled on the tiled floor near a potted fern, his weathered hat beside him, and one arm tucked oddly beneath his chest. His face was turned toward the ceiling, eyes closed, but his expression wasn't peaceful. There was a tension around his mouth, as if he'd been trying to speak when whatever happened to him occurred. Helen knelt beside him, her fingers automatically seeking a pulse at his throat. The skin was cool to the touch. He'd been gone for a while, but it was what she saw next that made her blood run cold. A single silvery pink petal rested just inside Gerald's partly open mouth, delicate as tissue paper, but unmistakably deliberate in its placement. Queen's Sorrow. Helen's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. This wasn't an accident or a natural death. This was a message. Someone had placed that petal there intentionally, turning Gerald's body into a macabre display. "Ivy!" Helen called, her voice carrying across the garden. "I need you in the conservatory. Now!" Within minutes, Ivy came running, her face flushed, and her hair escaping from its careful arrangement. She skidded to a halt at the conservatory entrance, taking in the scene with growing horror. "Oh God, Gerald," she whispered, one hand flying to her mouth. "What happened?" "Call Sheriff Carson," Helen said, standing slowly. "And clear the area. No one else comes in here until he arrives." Ivy fumbled for her phone, but Helen could see her hands shaking. "Do you think he had a heart attack? He's been working so hard lately, and he's not young." "Look at his mouth," Helen said quietly. Ivy followed her gaze and gasped. "Is that Queen's sorrow, the variety that's supposed to be extinct?" The implications hung heavy in the air between them. This wasn't just a death, it was a statement. Someone was telling them that Gerald's investigation into the garden's secrets had gotten too close to the truth. While they waited for the sheriff, Helen carefully examined the scene without disturbing anything. Gerald's position suggested he'd fallen suddenly, perhaps while reaching for something on a nearby shelf. His clothing was undisturbed, and there were no obvious signs of violence. But there was something else, a faint residue on his right hand, sticky and slightly discolored. "Ivy," Helen said, "did Gerald have any known health problems? Heart condition, diabetes? Anything that might cause sudden collapse?" "Not that I know of. He was actually quite fit for his age. Walked miles through the garden every day, ate carefully, didn't smoke or drink much." Ivy paused, studying Gerald's still form. "He did mention feeling dizzy yesterday afternoon, but he attributed it to working in the hot greenhouse." "When did you last see him alive?" "About 7 this morning. He was in the tool shed, preparing for the day's maintenance. He seemed agitated, kept muttering about needing to finish something before the crowds arrived." Helen noted the time. It was now nearly 9:30, and Gerald's body temperature suggested he'd been dead for at least an hour, possibly longer. Sheriff Mike Carson arrived within 20 minutes, accompanied by 2 deputies and the county medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Kim. Mike greeted Helen with a grim nod. He'd worked with her on enough cases to know that her presence at a suspicious death was rarely coincidental. "What do we have?" he asked, pulling on latex gloves. Helen walked him through her discovery, pointing out the petal without touching anything. Mike crouched beside Gerald's body, his expression growing more serious as he took in the details. "No signs of struggle," he observed. "No obvious trauma. Could have been a heart attack or stroke." "Look at his mouth," Helen said. Mike leaned closer and whistled low. "That wasn't placed there by accident." Dr. Kim began her preliminary examination while Mike and Helen stepped outside to discuss the scene. The festival was in full swing around them, but Ivy had managed to cordon off the conservatory with volunteers and tactful explanations about maintenance issues. "Tell me about this flower," Mike said, consulting his notebook. "Queen's sorrow. According to the official records, the variety was lost in a greenhouse fire in 1987. But there's a thriving specimen in the trial garden, and Gerald was investigating discrepancies in the plant registries." "You think someone killed him to stop his investigation?" "I think someone wanted to send a very specific message. The petal placement is theatrical. It's meant to be discovered and understood by people who know the garden's history." Mike nodded grimly. "Who would know enough to make that connection?" "Anyone involved with the archive work. Ivy, Margot Avery, Clarice Moore. Possibly Victor Bellamy if he's done his research on the property." Dr. Kim emerged from the conservatory, stripping off her gloves. "Preliminary examination suggests no obvious cause of death. No signs of violence, but I'm seeing some unusual symptoms." "Such as?" Mike asked. "Slight discoloration around the fingernails, and that residue on his hand tests positive for plant alkaloids. I'll need to run full toxicology, but my initial impression is possible poisoning." Helen's pulse quickened. "What kind of plant alkaloids?" "Similar to digitalis compounds found in foxglove, but with some unusual markers. I'll know more after lab analysis." Mike looked at Helen. You said Gerald was investigating this Queen Sorrow variety. Could it be toxic? According to Ivy, there were concerns about the plant's properties back in the 80s. That might be why it was supposedly destroyed. But if it wasn't actually destroyed, then someone's been cultivating a potentially dangerous plant for 35 years, Helen finished. And Gerald figured it out. They were interrupted by a commotion near the main festival area. Clarice Moore was arguing with a volunteer, her voice rising with each exchange. I have every right to access the archives, Clarice was saying. My research is legitimate, and I've followed all the proper procedures. The volunteer, a nervous-looking young man with a clipboard, kept shaking his head. I'm sorry, miss, but Ms. Radley said the archive building is closed today for inventory. That's convenient, Clarice snapped. First, Gerald refuses to discuss the trial records, and now the entire archive is suddenly off-limits. Helen and Mike exchanged glances. They approached the group, and Clarice turned to them with obvious frustration. Perhaps you can help, she said to Helen. I'm trying to research my grandmother's work here in the 1980s, but I keep running into bureaucratic roadblocks. What specifically are you looking for? Helen asked. Documentation about the hybrid breeding program she was involved with, particularly anything related to the Queen Sorrow variety. Clarice's eyes narrowed. I have reason to believe the official story about its destruction isn't accurate. Mike stepped forward. Ms. Moore, I'm Sheriff Carson. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Gerald Booth. Clarice paled slightly. What about him? Is he in trouble? He's dead, Mike said bluntly. Found in the conservatory this morning. The color drained completely from Clarice's face. Dead? How? We're still investigating. When did you last speak with him? Clarice looked genuinely shaken. Yesterday afternoon. I was asking him about the trial garden layouts, trying to understand where my grandmother's experimental plots would have been located. He was evasive, said some things were better left buried. Did he seem ill or distressed? More like frightened, she admitted. He kept looking around as if he thought someone might be listening. And he had this old ledger with him that he wouldn't let me see. Helen made a mental note. Did he say anything specific about why he was frightened? He mentioned that someone had been asking too many questions about the archive records. Said there were people who wouldn't want certain information to come to light. Clarice paused. He warned me to be careful about my research. Said the garden had dangerous secrets. Mike scribbled in his notebook. Where were you between 7 and 9 this morning? In my studio apartment, preparing my presentation materials for today's competition. I didn't arrive at the garden until about 9:15. She looked between them anxiously. You don't think someone killed him, do you? Before either could answer, Margot Avery approached the group. She moved slowly, her face pale and drawn. I heard about Gerald, she said quietly. This is terrible, just terrible. Ms. Avery, Mike said, I'll need to speak with you as well. But first, can you tell me who else has access to the conservatory after hours? Just Gerald, myself, and Ivy, plus the security service that does night rounds. Margot looked genuinely grief-stricken. Gerald was like a brother to me. We'd worked together for decades. When did you last see him? Yesterday evening, around 6. He was in the archive building, cross-referencing some old trial records with current plant locations. He seemed agitated about something he'd found. Helen leaned forward. Did he share what was troubling him? Margot hesitated. He said he'd discovered evidence that some of the plants in the trial garden weren't what they were supposed to be, that someone had been maintaining varieties that should have been destroyed decades ago. Did he mention Queen Sorrow specifically? Yes, Margot whispered. He said it was the key to everything, that if people knew it still existed and knew what it was capable of, it would destroy several reputations and possibly endanger lives. Mike looked around the group. I'm going to need formal statements from all of you, and Ms. Avery, I'll need access to those archive records Gerald was examining. Of course, Margot said. Though I should warn you, someone broke into the archive building earlier this week. Nothing seemed to be stolen, but some files had been moved around. Helen felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting. Gerald's death wasn't random. It was the culmination of a conflict that had been building for days, possibly weeks. Someone had been trying to access information that Gerald was protecting, and when subtle methods failed, they'd resorted to murder. "There's something else," she said to Mike. "Gerald told me yesterday that if anything happened to him, I should check the old fountain in the east wing, under the stone frog." Mike nodded. "We'll search there after we finish processing the scene." As the group began to disperse, Helen noticed Victor Bellamy standing at the edge of the crowd that had gathered around the conservatory. He wasn't approaching, just watching, his expression unreadable. When he saw her looking, he gave a slight nod and walked away toward the parking area. Something about his behavior bothered her. Most people would approach to ask questions or offer help. Victor's careful distance suggested either guilt or a desire to avoid scrutiny. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of police activity and whispered conversations among festival goers. The conservatory remained cordoned off, but Ivy managed to keep the rest of the festival running with the help of dedicated volunteers. The mood was subdued, but life and the celebration of Rosewood's centennial continued. Helen spent the time walking the garden paths with Shadow and Halo, thinking through what she'd learned. Gerald had been investigating inconsistencies in the plant records. Someone had been trying to access the archives, and a supposedly extinct rose variety was not only alive, but potentially dangerous. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, but she was still missing crucial connections. Who had been maintaining Queen Sorrow all these years? Why had it been hidden? And most importantly, who was willing to kill to keep those secrets buried? As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the garden, Helen knew that Gerald's death was just the beginning. Someone had committed murder to protect a secret that went back 35 years, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they felt threatened. The garden's beauty remained unchanged. Roses bloomed, bees hummed among the flowers, and visitors strolled the pathways in peaceful contemplation. But underneath that serene surface, something poisonous was growing, and Helen was determined to root it out before it could claim another victim. Chapter 3: Suspicions and Shadows. By the next morning, the mood at Rosewood Garden had shifted palpably. The air was still sweet with rose perfume, but the cheerful hum of activity had dulled to a cautious murmur. Word had spread: Gerald Booth, the garden's beloved groundskeeper, was dead, and the circumstances were anything but ordinary. Helen found herself back at the conservatory, this time not as a guest, but as a quiet investigator. She wore her light canvas jacket over practical pants, notebook in one pocket, Shadow on one side, Halo on the other. The conservatory was cordoned off by a polite but unmistakable velvet rope, Sheriff Mike's doing. A deputy stood by with a clipboard, eyeing everyone who approached. The morning brought news that confirmed Helen's suspicions. Dr. Kim had called Mike at dawn with preliminary toxicology results. Gerald had been poisoned with a concentrated alkaloid compound consistent with cardiac glycosides, the same family of toxins found in foxglove, but with unusual molecular markers that suggested a hybrid or modified plant source. The concentration was significant, Mike had told Helen over coffee at 7 a.m. Enough to cause cardiac arrest within 30 to 40 minutes of exposure. But here's the interesting part. The compound doesn't match any known commercial foxglove varieties. Dr. Kim thinks it came from a plant that's been selectively bred or modified. Helen had felt a chill at those words. Queen Sorrow wasn't just an extinct rose. It was a weapon that someone had been cultivating for decades. Now, as she watched the festival goers navigate around the crime scene tape, Helen noted how differently people were behaving. Conversations happened in hushed tones, and several participants had already left early, claiming sudden emergencies or family obligations. The ones who remained moved with the careful deliberation of people who knew they were being watched. Clarice Moore stood a few paces back from the barrier, arms crossed over her tailored jumpsuit. Her sculpture was still covered, awaiting judgment, its dramatic silhouette casting long shadows across the flagstones. But today, Clarice looked less like an artist and more like someone fighting a losing battle. Helen approached, noting the dark circles under Clarice's eyes and the slight tremor in her hands. Rough morning? Clarice didn't look at her immediately. When she did, her expression was a mixture of grief and frustration. He wasn't just a gardener, you know. Gerald was the institutional memory of this place. He remembered every plant, every experiment, every person who ever worked here. I know. He was the soul of this place. Clarice turned fully toward Helen, her composure cracking slightly. He was helping me, with the old archive. I think he knew the truth about Queen's sorrow, and the fire that supposedly destroyed it. Helen studied her carefully. Yesterday, Clarice had seemed primarily concerned with her competition and her grandmother's legacy. Today, there was something deeper. Fear, perhaps, or the realization that Gerald's death had changed everything. You believe the fire was a cover-up? I don't believe. I know. Clarice's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. My grandmother was one of the last to work on that hybrid. She kept private notes, sketches, even some pressed samples. And then she was erased from the records, fired, silenced. Gerald was trying to help me prove it. Why would anyone care about a flower that much? Clarice gave a bitter smile. Because Queen's sorrow wasn't just a flower. It was a breakthrough. Disease-resistant, incredibly hardy, with blooms that lasted weeks instead of days. But it also had properties that made certain people nervous. What kind of properties? My grandmother's notes mention cardiac effects in small animals during preliminary testing. Nothing definitive, but enough to warrant further study. Instead of investigating properly, the board ordered the entire line destroyed. Clarice's hands clenched into fists. But someone saved it. Someone's been keeping it alive all these years, and Gerald figured out who. Helen felt pieces clicking into place. Who do you think saved it? Clarice's gaze drifted toward the archive building. Start with Margot Avery. She had access to everything back then. She could have saved cuttings, falsified the destruction records, maintained the plant in secret. Why would she do that? Because Queen's sorrow represented her life's work, or her grandmother's anyway. Margot was just an assistant in 1987, but she had ambition. What if she saw an opportunity to claim credit for a valuable discovery? Helen considered this theory. It would explain Margot's defensive behavior about the archives, her reluctance to discuss the fire, and her current position as the garden's chief botanical authority. But it didn't explain why Gerald had to die now. If Margot saved the plant, why kill Gerald? He was helping you research the truth. Maybe that's exactly why, Clarice said darkly. Gerald wasn't just uncovering the plant's survival. He was documenting who had maintained it and why. That kind of evidence could destroy a career, especially if it proved academic fraud or deliberate endangerment. Helen nodded slowly, but something about Clarice's theory felt incomplete. There were too many assumptions, too many gaps in motive and opportunity. Still, it was a starting point. She found Margot in the cool interior of the archive wing, seated behind a wide oak desk, flipping through an old ledger with gloved fingers. The scent of old paper and pressed leaves filled the room, but today it carried an undertone of anxiety, or perhaps that was just Helen's imagination. Margot looked up as Helen entered. Her salt and pepper hair was pinned into a bun, and she wore a burgundy shawl despite the warming day. Her eyes were red-rimmed, whether from grief or sleeplessness, Helen couldn't tell. "You're here about Gerald," she said without preamble. It wasn't a question. Helen nodded, settling into the chair across from the desk. "You two worked closely for a long time." "Decades," Margot said, her voice thick with emotion. He was infuriating and brilliant. He remembered every plant tag he ever wrote by hand, every cross-pollination experiment we ever attempted. This place won't be the same without him. "And did he ever talk to you about Queen's sorrow?" Margot's fingers paused on the ledger page she'd been examining. The pause was brief, but Helen caught it. "Yes, he asked about the trial records from 1987. I told him they were sealed by board order and that I wasn't authorized to release them without proper clearance." Helen leaned forward slightly. "Sealed by whom?" By the Rosewood Hybrid Ethics Committee. I was part of it back then. We retired that line for safety reasons. Margot's voice was careful, measured, as if she'd rehearsed this explanation. Because it was toxic? Because it hadn't been properly tested. There were reports of skin reactions, allergic responses, and one volunteer nearly passed out during pruning. Margot met Helen's eyes. We couldn't risk public exposure to an unstable hybrid. Was your recommendation to destroy it? Margot hesitated, and in that hesitation, Helen saw the first crack in her official story. No, I recommended further study in a controlled environment, but the board overruled me. Why? Because the fire made it convenient to close the entire research line. No messy ethical reviews, no expensive safety protocols, no public liability concerns. Helen pulled the rose tag from her pocket, the one Gerald had hidden under the stone frog, and placed it gently on the desk. Then, how do you explain this? Margot's breath caught audibly. She reached out and touched the tag with trembling fingers, as if it were a holy relic. I haven't seen this tag in 35 years, she whispered. It was hidden under the stone frog fountain. Gerald left it for me to find. Margot's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Then he knew he was in danger. He was trying to tell you something. What was he trying to tell me, Margot? That someone has been maintaining Queen's sorrow in secret, that the destruction records were falsified, that the fire in 1987 wasn't an accident. It was arson designed to cover up a theft. Helen felt her pulse quicken. A theft of what? Of the Queen's sorrow breeding stock. Someone stole the parent plants and the research data before setting the fire. They made it look like everything was destroyed, but they were actually covering their tracks. Who would have had the knowledge and access to do that? Margot looked away, her composure finally cracking. Anyone on the research team, myself included. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Helen studied Margot's face, seeing guilt and fear in equal measure, but also something else. Relief, perhaps, at finally sharing a burden she'd carried for decades. Did you steal the plants, Margot? No, Margot said firmly. But I know who did, and I think Gerald figured it out too. Before Helen could press for details, Sheriff Mike appeared in the doorway of the archive room. His expression was grim, and he held an evidence bag containing what looked like botanical specimens. Ms. Avery, he said, I need you to come with me. We found something in your office at home. Margot paled. What kind of something? Mike held up the evidence bag. Dried Queen's sorrow petals, along with what appears to be extraction equipment and notes about cardiac glycoside concentration. Helen's heart sank. The evidence seemed damning, but something about it felt too convenient, too obvious. Someone was setting Margot up, just as they'd tried to implicate Clarice with the planted sculpture bloom. I can explain, Margot said, standing slowly. Those samples are from my research into the plant's toxicity. I've been trying to understand what made it dangerous, so we could develop safe handling protocols. Then why hide them? Mike asked. Because I was afraid. Gerald's death proved that someone is willing to kill to protect their secrets. I thought if I could identify the specific toxins, I could prove who had access to the knowledge needed to weaponize the plant. Mike looked skeptical, but Helen saw the logic in Margot's explanation. A guilty person wouldn't keep evidence of their crime at home where it could easily be found. This felt like another misdirection, another attempt by the real killer to shift suspicion. Sheriff, Helen said, I think we need to consider that someone is actively trying to frame multiple suspects. First Clarice with the sculpture, now Margot with planted evidence. You think someone broke into Miss Avery's home to plant the samples? I think someone wants us focused on everyone except themselves. Mike nodded slowly. Then who benefits from having both Clarice and Margot under suspicion? Helen thought about Victor Bellamy's careful distance from the investigation, his interest in the garden's development potential, and his extensive knowledge of botanical research facilities. But there was still something missing, a direct connection between Victor and the Queen's Sorrow research. I need to check something, she said. Give me an hour before you make any arrests. Mike looked at his watch. 1 hour. But if I don't get better answers, I'm taking Ms. Avery in for formal questioning. Helen left the archive building with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that the real killer was still walking free among the festival goers. Someone was playing an elaborate game of misdirection, using their knowledge of the garden's history and the participants' relationships to deflect suspicion from themselves. As she walked toward the trial garden where the living Queen Sorrow specimen grew, Helen realized that the key to solving Gerald's murder lay not just in understanding who had access to the toxic plant, but in understanding who had the most to lose if the truth about the 1987 fire came to light. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden paths, and Helen felt the weight of time pressing against her. Someone had already killed once to protect their secret. If she didn't identify them soon, they might kill again to preserve their carefully constructed lies. She paused at the edge of the trial garden, looking down at the thriving Queen Sorrow bush with its silvery pink blooms. Somewhere in this beautiful, deadly plant lay the answers she needed. She just had to figure out how to make it reveal its secrets before those secrets claimed another victim. Chapter 4: Tangled Roots. Morning light spilled over the hedgerows as Helen slipped through the quiet paths of the eastern grounds, her mind racing with the revelations from the previous day. The garden was hushed, holding its breath. Dew sparkled on petals, and a low mist still hugged the ornamental grasses. It should have been peaceful, but Helen's thoughts were churning with fragments of truth, motive, and carefully constructed deception. She had spent the night reviewing everything she knew, laying out the timeline on her hotel room desk like pieces of a puzzle. Gerald's murder wasn't random. It was the culmination of a 35-year cover-up that someone was desperate to protect. But the pattern of evidence seemed almost too convenient, too neatly pointing to different suspects in turn. First, Clarice, with her family connection and obvious research into Queen's Sorrow. Then Margot, with her historical knowledge and the planted evidence at her home. Each frame job had been sophisticated, suggesting someone with intimate knowledge of both the garden's history and the current player's vulnerabilities. Helen met Sheriff Mike by the archive wing as planned. They'd agreed to examine the building more thoroughly, looking for signs of the break-in Margot had mentioned, and any additional evidence that might point to the real perpetrator. "Any word on the toxicology analysis?" Helen asked as Mike unlocked the archive door. "Doctor," Kim called an hour ago. The alkaloid concentration in Gerald's system was massive, enough to kill a horse. But here's the interesting part. The compound had been processed, concentrated into an oil or tincture. This wasn't accidental exposure from handling the plant. Someone extracted the poison deliberately. Exactly. Which means we're looking for someone with botanical knowledge and access to extraction equipment. They entered the archive building together, immediately noting the meticulous organization that characterized Margot's work. Files were labeled and sorted, research materials stored in climate-controlled cabinets, and historical documents preserved in acid-free containers. But there were subtle signs of disturbance: a filing cabinet slightly askew, dust patterns on shelves that suggested items had been moved and replaced. Someone was looking for something specific, Helen observed, examining a section where folders had been rifled through. "Look at this." They went through the 1987 files systematically, but left everything else untouched. Mike nodded, photographing the evidence. Margot mentioned that some files had been moved. Question is, what were they looking for? Helen pulled on latex gloves and carefully examined the 1987 section. Most of the folders contained routine administrative documents, budget reports, personnel files, maintenance schedules. But there was a gap where something should have been. "Mike, look at this." She pointed to a file tab labeled Fire Investigation, 1987. The folder was there, but it was nearly empty. Someone removed most of the contents. They opened the folder together. Inside were only a few pages: the official fire department report, an insurance claim form, and a brief statement from the fire chief concluding that the blaze was caused by electrical failure in the greenhouse heating system. "Pretty thin investigation for a fire that destroyed valuable research," Mike commented. "Or a very thorough cover-up," Helen replied. She noticed something odd about the insurance form. Look at the claim amount. $200,000 for destroyed plant materials and research equipment. That's a lot of money for supposedly failed experiments. And look at the beneficiary signature, Mike added, pointing to the bottom of the form. V. Bellamy, authorized representative. Helen felt a chill of recognition. Victor Bellamy. He was involved with the garden even back then. As what? That's what we need to find out. They spent another hour searching the archive, finding more subtle evidence of the break-in. Someone had photographed or copied numerous documents. There were faint traces of photocopy toner on some pages, and several files showed signs of having been hastily reassembled. As they prepared to leave, Helen noticed something else. In a corner filing cabinet marked Personnel Records, Historical, one drawer was slightly open. Inside, she found employment files for garden staff dating back to the 1980s. Most were unremarkable, but one caught her attention. Victor Bellamy, Consultant, Botanical Research Funding, 1985 to 1988. He wasn't just involved, Helen said, showing Mike the file. He was a consultant during the exact period when Queen's Sorrow was being developed. Mike whistled low. That's our connection. But why would he want to steal research he was already funding? Maybe he wasn't just funding it. Maybe he was planning to commercialize it. They left the archive building with a clearer picture of Victor's historical involvement, but Helen knew they needed more evidence before confronting him. Someone as sophisticated as Victor wouldn't have left obvious traces of his current activities. Helen decided to visit the trial garden again, this time to examine the Queen's Sorrow specimen more carefully. As she approached the plant, she noticed something she'd missed before, a small irrigation system that appeared newer than the other garden infrastructure. The tubing was modern, and there was a discreet control box hidden behind the plant marker. Automatic watering system, she murmured to herself, crouching to examine it more closely. The system was sophisticated, with what appeared to be nutrient injectors and pH monitoring equipment. This wasn't standard garden maintenance. Someone had been giving this plant specialized care. Shadow sniffed around the base of the plant and whined softly. Helen followed his lead and found something partially buried in the mulch, a small glass vial with residue that matched the description of the extraction equipment found at Margot's house. Someone's been harvesting this plant, she realized, and recently. The discovery of the vial confirmed Helen's theory that someone had been systematically extracting toxins from the Queen's Sorrow specimen. But it also raised a new question. If the killer had been harvesting poison from this plant, why were they trying to frame Margot with planted evidence? Unless the evidence at Margot's house wasn't planted, unless she really had been extracting the toxins, but for a different reason than murder. Helen returned to find Margot in the temporary holding area Mike had set up in Ivy's office. The older woman looked exhausted but not defeated. Margot, Helen said, settling into a chair across from her. I need you to tell me the truth about those extraction samples Mike found at your house. Margot sighed deeply. I've been trying to develop an antidote. An antidote? When Gerald started his investigation, he shared some of his concerns with me. He'd found evidence that someone had been harvesting toxins from the Queen's Sorrow plant. He was afraid they might use it to hurt someone. Helen leaned forward. So you were trying to create a countermeasure? I've been working with a colleague at the university's pharmacology department. We've been analyzing the plant's alkaloids, trying to understand their mechanism of action so we could develop a treatment protocol. Margot's voice was steady now, as if relieved to finally tell the truth. The samples Mike found were part of that research. Why didn't you tell him this immediately? Because my colleague insisted on confidentiality until we could publish our findings, and because I was afraid no one would believe me. Margot looked directly at Helen. The person who's been harvesting this plant has been very careful to cover their tracks. I thought if I could prove the toxin's effects scientifically, it would help catch Gerald's killer. Helen felt another piece click into place. Who else knew about your antidote research? Only Gerald, my university colleague, and... Margot paused, her face paling. Victor Bellamy. He approached me last month, said he was interested in funding botanical research. He asked very specific questions about plant toxicology and medicinal applications. What kind of questions? About extraction methods, concentration techniques, and how various alkaloids affect cardiac function. Margot's voice was barely a whisper now. I thought he was just being thorough about his investment potential. But if he was planning to use that information to hurt someone... Helen's pulse quickened. Victor hadn't just been involved in the original Queen's Sorrow research, he'd been actively gathering current information about the plant's toxic properties. The consultation with Margot gave him the knowledge he needed to extract and concentrate the poison that killed Gerald. Margot, this is important. Did you ever give Victor access to the garden after hours? He has a key. As a major donor and development consultant, he's allowed access to most areas of the garden for his planning work. Helen stood quickly. Victor had means, motive, and opportunity. He'd been systematically gathering information about the plant's toxicity while positioning himself to benefit from Gerald's silence. When Gerald got too close to exposing the truth about the 1987 theft and cover-up, Victor had used his knowledge of plant toxicology to eliminate the threat. But Helen knew that having a theory wasn't the same as having proof. Victor was too sophisticated to leave obvious evidence, and his wealth and position in the community would make accusations difficult to prove. She needed to force his hand somehow to make him reveal himself. "Mike," she said, finding the sheriff outside Ivy's office. "I think I know who killed Gerald, but we're going to need him to confess. He's too smart to have left evidence we can use in court." "What do you have in mind?" Helen looked toward the festival grounds, where Victor was once again holding court with local officials and potential investors. "We're going to give him exactly what he's been trying to prevent, public exposure of the truth about Queen's Sorrow." "And you think that will make him panic and do something stupid?" "I think it will make him desperate. And desperate people make mistakes." That afternoon, Helen approached Ivy with an unusual request. "I want to hold a special presentation about the garden's botanical history," she said. "This evening, right here in the main pavilion. We'll invite everyone, festival participants, donors, local officials, the press." Ivy looked confused. "What kind of presentation?" "The truth about Queen's Sorrow, about the 1987 fire, the research that was supposedly lost, and the cover-up that's been maintained for 35 years. Helen, that could destroy the garden's reputation. Some of our biggest donors were involved in those decisions." "Including Victor Bellamy?" Ivy's face went pale. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Gerald died because he was about to expose a secret that someone has been protecting for decades. And if we don't root out that poison now, more people will die." After much persuasion, Ivy agreed to the evening presentation. Word spread quickly through the festival grounds. There would be a special historical reveal about Rosewood's most famous, lost variety. Helen spent the afternoon preparing her presentation, knowing that somewhere in the audience would be a killer who had already demonstrated their willingness to use the garden's beauty to hide their crimes. She was counting on that killer's desperation to finally bring them into the light. Chapter 5. The Bloom Unfolds. The evening air carried a hint of autumn's approach as Helen stood before the makeshift podium in Rosewood's main pavilion. String lights twinkled overhead, casting warm pools of light across the assembled crowd. What had started as a garden festival celebration had transformed into something far more serious, a reckoning with secrets that had been buried for over 3 decades. Helen surveyed the audience, noting the careful positioning of key players. Ivy sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, worry etched across her features. Clarice occupied a seat near the side, her notebook open and pen ready, still the dedicated researcher despite everything. Margot had been released from questioning and sat with Sheriff Mike, who remained alert despite the academic setting. And there, in the third row, sat Victor Bellamy. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccable, but Helen could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his fingers drummed against his knee. He'd positioned himself where he could see all the exits, the behavior of a man preparing for flight. "Ladies and gentlemen, Helen began, her voice carrying clearly across the pavilion. Tonight we're going to discuss the true history of one of Rosewood Garden's most significant botanical achievements, the hybrid rose known as Queen's Sorrow. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several people shifted in their seats, and Helen noticed Victor's drumming fingers still. According to official records, Queen's Sorrow was destroyed in a greenhouse fire in 1987, along with all research data and breeding stock. But as many of you know, there's a thriving specimen of this supposedly extinct variety growing in our trial garden right now. Helen clicked to her first slide, a photograph of the current Queen's Sorrow plant in full bloom. The silvery pink petals seemed to glow in the projected image. The question isn't whether the plant survived, she continued. The question is how it survived, who maintained it in secret for 35 years, and why Gerald Booth had to die when he got too close to the truth. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Several people looked around nervously, as if suddenly realizing they might be sitting next to a killer. Helen clicked to the next slide, a copy of the 1987 fire report. The official investigation concluded that an electrical failure caused the blaze, but insurance records show that the claim was processed unusually quickly with minimal investigation into the actual cause. She highlighted a section of the document. The insurance payout was substantial, $200,000 in 1987 money, equivalent to nearly $500,000 today. That's a lot of compensation for supposedly failed experiments. Victor leaned forward slightly, his composed mask beginning to crack. More interesting still, Helen continued, is the identity of the authorized representative who processed this claim. She clicked to the next slide, showing the insurance signature. Victor Bellamy, listed as a consultant to the Rosewood Botanical Research Program. Now the crowd turned to look at Victor, who managed to maintain his composure despite the obvious scrutiny. He even smiled slightly, as if amused by the historical curiosity. Mr. Bellamy, Helen said directly, perhaps you could enlighten us about your role in the Queen's Sorrow research program? Victor rose gracefully, every inch the confident philanthropist. I was a young investor then, Ms. Lighthall. My family's foundation provided funding for several botanical research initiatives. The insurance matter was simply administrative. When the fire destroyed the research, we helped process the paperwork to recover some of the foundation's investment. How generous, Helen said. And did your foundation recover its full investment? I believe so, yes. It was a long time ago. Helen clicked to another slide, a detailed financial record she'd obtained from the archive. According to these documents, your foundation not only recovered its initial investment, but received an additional payout for proprietary research data and genetic materials that were supposedly destroyed in the fire. Victor's smile faltered slightly. I'm sure the paperwork was handled properly at the time. Oh, I'm sure it was. Helen's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. The problem is that the genetic materials weren't actually destroyed, were they? Someone removed the Queen's Sorrow breeding stock before the fire and kept it alive in secret. She clicked to a new slide, showing the sophisticated irrigation system she'd discovered at the trial garden. This equipment is less than 5 years old. Someone has been giving that plant specialized care, maintaining it not as a memorial, but as a working botanical specimen. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Gerald Booth discovered this deception. He found evidence that the Queen's Sorrow variety had never been extinct, that someone had been cultivating it and extracting compounds from it. When he threatened to expose this secret, he was murdered. Helen paused, letting the weight of her accusations settle over the audience. The killer used a concentrated extract from the Queen's Sorrow plant, a cardiac glycoside toxin that stops the heart within minutes of ingestion. But creating such an extract requires sophisticated knowledge of plant chemistry and access to extraction equipment. She clicked to a slide showing the equipment found at Margot's house. The killer tried to frame Margot Avery by planting evidence at her home, but Margot was actually working to develop an antidote, not a poison. Her research was known to only a few people, including the person who consulted with her about plant toxicology and extraction methods. Victor stood abruptly, This is quite entertaining, Ms. Lighthall, but I think you're letting your imagination run away with you. If you'll excuse me, I have other commitments this evening. Actually, Mr. Bellamy, I think you should stay, because there's one more thing Gerald discovered before he died. Helen clicked to her final slide, a photograph of a ledger page in Gerald's handwriting. Gerald found the original Queen's Sorrow research notes, hidden in the archive for 35 years. They detail not just the plant's cultivation, but its potential commercial applications. The ledger page showed detailed notes about the plant's unique properties, its disease resistance, its unusual longevity, and most importantly, its potential pharmaceutical applications. At the bottom of the page, in Gerald's careful script, was a note. VB inquired about medicinal patents, commercial exploitation planned. You weren't just funding research, Victor. You were planning to commercialize it. But when the hybrid committee raised safety concerns, you couldn't risk a public investigation that might reveal the plant's toxic properties. So you staged the fire, stole the breeding stock, and waited. Victor's composure finally cracked. This is absurd speculation. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. Don't I? Helen smiled grimly. Sheriff Carson, would you like to share what your team found this afternoon? Mike stood, pulling out his notebook. We executed a search warrant for Mr. Bellamy's greenhouse facility in the industrial district. We found extensive botanical extraction equipment, detailed notes on cardiac glycoside chemistry, and samples of processed Queen's Sorrow toxin. The crowd gasped. Several people rose from their seats, instinctively moving away from Victor. We also found Gerald Booth's missing ledger, the one with the original research notes and cultivation records, along with correspondence between Mr. Bellamy and several pharmaceutical companies about potential licensing agreements for a proprietary botanical compound. Victor's face had gone ashen. That equipment is for legitimate research. I was investigating the plant's properties to ensure public safety. By extracting concentrated poison? Helen asked. By maintaining a supposedly extinct variety in secret for 35 years? By killing the one man who could expose your theft? Gerald's death was an accident, Victor said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I never meant for him to die. I was only trying to prevent him from destroying decades of careful work. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Mike was already moving toward Victor, handcuffs ready. I created something beautiful, Victor continued, his voice rising with desperation. A plant that could revolutionize medicine, agriculture, everything. Gerald was going to destroy it all with his moral objections and his concerns about safety. So you poisoned his tea, Helen said quietly. I gave him a sample to analyze. I thought if he understood the plant's potential, he would support controlled development instead of demanding its destruction. Victor's hands shook as he spoke. But he drank it instead of testing it. It was an accident. An accident that you covered up by placing a petal in his mouth. I wanted people to understand. The plant isn't evil. It's misunderstood. Gerald died because of ignorance, not malice. Mike had reached Victor now, but the older man made no attempt to flee. He seemed deflated, defeated by the weight of his own words. Victor Bellamy, Mike said formally, you're under arrest for the murder of Gerald Booth and for conspiracy to commit fraud. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Victor looked back at Helen with something that might have been respect. You understand, don't you? He said. The plant's potential was worth preserving. Gerald would have destroyed something that could have helped thousands of people. Gerald would have ensured it was developed safely, Helen replied. There's a difference between potential and poison, Victor. You chose poison. As Mike led Victor away, the crowd began to disperse in stunned silence. The festival atmosphere had evaporated completely, replaced by the sobering reality of murder and betrayal. Ivy approached Helen as she gathered her presentation materials. What happens now? To the garden, I mean. Helen looked toward the trial garden, where the Queen's Sorrow plant continued to bloom in peaceful ignorance of the chaos it had caused. Now you get to write the real history, she said. All of it. The beauty and the danger, the dreams and the nightmares. That's what Gerald would have wanted. The complete truth, not a sanitized version. And the plant? That's up to the community. Maybe it deserves a chance to fulfill its potential safely, with proper oversight and ethical guidelines. Or maybe some secrets are too dangerous to preserve. Helen packed the last of her materials and whistled for Shadow and Halo, who had waited patiently through the entire presentation. As she walked back toward her car, she reflected on the case's resolution. Victor had been right about one thing: Queen's sorrow did have enormous potential. But potential without ethics was just another form of poison, and Gerald Booth had died trying to prevent that poison from spreading. The garden would survive this scandal, Helen was certain. Gardens were resilient, adaptive, capable of growing beauty from the darkest soil, but it would take time, care, and the kind of honest stewardship that Gerald had embodied. As she drove away from Rosewood Garden, Helen could see the festival lights twinkling in her rearview mirror, now seeming more like memorial candles than celebration. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for the garden community, but tonight at least, the truth had finally bloomed. Chapter 6. Embers Beneath the Garden. Morning light spilled over the hedgerows as Helen returned to Rosewood Garden for what she hoped would be her final visit as an investigator. The mist had lifted early, revealing a garden that seemed somehow different. Cleaner, perhaps, as if the exposure of Victor's 35-year deception had purified the very air. The festival had officially ended with Victor's arrest, but many participants had remained to help with cleanup and to process what they'd witnessed. Helen found small groups of volunteers working quietly among the flower beds, their conversations subdued, but not without hope. Sheriff Mike met her at the conservatory, which had finally been reopened after the crime scene processing was complete. The space felt different now, less haunted, more like a sanctuary again. Dr. Kim finished the final autopsy report, Mike said, handing Helen a folder. Gerald died within 20 minutes of ingesting the concentrated toxin. The amount in his system was enough to kill 3 people his size. Helen scanned the report, noting the technical details that confirmed their theory. So Victor wasn't lying about it being stronger than he intended. Maybe not about the dosage, but he was definitely lying about it being accidental. We found detailed notes in his greenhouse about extraction concentrations and timing. He knew exactly how potent his poison was. They walked through the conservatory together, pausing at the spot where Gerald had fallen. Someone, probably Ivy, had placed a small memorial there, a simple stone marker surrounded by white roses, with an engraved plaque reading, "Gerald Booth, Guardian of Truth." "What will happen to Victor's botanical operation?" Helen asked. "The DA is seizing all his equipment and research materials as evidence. The pharmaceutical companies he was negotiating with have all distanced themselves from the project. Turns out legitimate businesses don't like being associated with murder and theft." "And the Queen's Sorrow plant itself?" Mike shrugged. "That's up to the garden's new management committee. They're calling a community meeting next week to decide its fate." Helen found Ivy in the archive building where she was working with Margot to restore the damaged files and create a complete historical record of the garden's research programs. Both women looked exhausted but determined. "How are you holding up?" Helen asked Ivy. "Better now that the truth is out," Ivy replied, looking up from a stack of documents. "It's strange. I thought exposing our dark history would destroy the garden's reputation, but the response has been surprisingly positive." "People appreciate honesty," Helen observed. "Several botanical institutions have already reached out about collaboration," Margot added. "They're interested in supporting ethical research here, with proper oversight and community involvement." Ivy nodded. "We're establishing new protocols for any experimental work, full transparency, ethical review boards, and community input on anything that could impact public safety." Helen examined some of the documents they were cataloging. Many were original research notes from the 1980s that Victor had hidden or stolen over the years. Now that his greenhouse had been searched, the complete picture of the Queen's Sorrow project was finally emerging. "Look at this," Margot said, showing Helen a folder of botanical sketches. "These are Clarice's grandmother's original drawings of the hybrid development process. Victor had kept them all these years, probably as insurance or leverage. The sketches were beautiful and detailed, showing the careful crossbreeding process that had created Queen's sorrow. But they also included detailed notes about the plant's toxic properties and potential dangers, warnings that had been ignored in the rush to commercialize the discovery. Her grandmother really was brilliant, Helen said, studying the precise botanical illustrations. She understood both the potential and the risks. Which is exactly why Victor had her fired and erased from the records, Ivy said grimly. She would have insisted on proper safety protocols that would have interfered with his commercial plans. Clarice appeared in the doorway of the archive, looking hesitant. "May I come in?" "Of course," Ivy said warmly. "We were just looking at your grandmother's research." Clarice entered slowly, her eyes immediately drawn to the familiar sketches. "I haven't seen these in 20 years. I thought they were lost forever." "Victor kept everything," Margot said gently. "I think he was planning to use your grandmother's work to support his patent applications, claiming the research as his own." Tears welled in Clarice's eyes as she touched one of the sketches. She spent her whole life believing she was a failure, that her work had been worthless. If she could see this vindication... "She can," Helen said softly. "Through you. You never gave up trying to restore her reputation." "I almost wish I had," Clarice admitted. "If I hadn't been pushing so hard for access to the archives, maybe Gerald would still be alive." "Gerald died because he was trying to protect the truth," Ivy said firmly. "Your research didn't kill him. Victor's greed did. Don't take responsibility for someone else's evil choices." Helen watched the three women work together, seeing how the shared trauma of Gerald's death and the revelation of Victor's crimes had created an unexpected bond between them. What had started as a competitive festival had become a collaborative effort to heal and rebuild. Later that morning, Helen visited the trial garden one final time. The Queen's sorrow plant looked the same as always, beautiful, mysterious, and quietly dangerous. But now she understood its full history, the dreams and nightmares it had inspired over the decades. A small crowd had gathered around the plant, including several people Helen recognized as botanical researchers and graduate students. They were examining it with the reverence usually reserved for historical artifacts. "What do you think will happen to it?" asked a young woman with a university ID badge. "That depends on the community," Helen replied. "It could be destroyed as too dangerous to preserve. It could be maintained under strict security as a research specimen. Or it could be developed responsibly with proper oversight and ethical guidelines." "What would you choose?" Helen considered the question carefully. "I think Gerald would have wanted it to fulfill its potential safely. He believed in the power of knowledge, but also in the responsibility that comes with it." She looked at the plant's silvery pink blooms, thinking about all the people whose lives had been touched by its beauty and its danger. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are also the most dangerous. The key is making sure they're handled by people who understand the difference between potential and poison. As afternoon approached, Helen found herself in the garden's memorial section, where a temporary marker had been placed for Gerald. The permanent memorial would be designed and installed later, but for now there was a simple wooden cross surrounded by dozens of flowers, left by visitors and colleagues. Sheriff Mike joined her there, having finished his final paperwork on the case. "Strange how it all worked out," he said. "Victor thought he was preserving something valuable, but he was really just protecting his own theft and lies." "The road to hell," Helen murmured. "You think there's any chance he actually believed his own justifications?" Helen considered this. "I think he started with good intentions. The plant really does have incredible potential. But somewhere along the way, his ego and greed took over. By the time he was murdering people to protect his secret, he was far from anything resembling good intentions. What about the others? Ivy, Margot, Clarice? They were all trapped by Victor's web of lies, but they were trying to do the right thing within the constraints they understood. Ivy wanted to protect the garden's reputation. Margot was trying to develop an antidote, Clarice was seeking justice for her grandmother. Mike nodded. And Gerald? Gerald was the conscience of this place. He saw through the lies and refused to compromise with evil, even when it cost him his life. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the gentle sounds of the garden, bees humming, leaves rustling, the distant laughter of children playing in the picnic area. "You know," Mike said eventually, "I've been thinking about what you said during the presentation, about the difference between potential and poison. What about it?" Seems like that applies to more than just plants. People, institutions, even good intentions can become poisonous if they're not handled with care and honesty. Helen smiled. "That's very philosophical, Sheriff." "Must be the garden's influence. Something about this place makes you think about growth and decay, beauty and danger." "And the importance of good stewardship," Helen added. That evening, Helen attended the informal memorial service that Ivy had organized for Gerald. It was held in the main pavilion, the same space where Victor's crimes had been exposed the night before. But the atmosphere tonight was completely different. Warm, celebratory, focused on honoring a life well lived rather than exposing dark secrets. People shared stories about Gerald's dedication, his encyclopedic knowledge of plants, his gentle humor, and his unwavering integrity. Ivy spoke about his role as the garden's institutional memory. Margot talked about their decades of collaboration and friendship. Even some of the festival participants who had barely known him shared memories of his kindness and expertise. As the service concluded, Helen realized that Gerald's real legacy wasn't just the truth he had died protecting, it was the example he had set of principled stewardship and moral courage. In a world where it was often easier to look the other way or compromise with lesser evils, Gerald had chosen to stand for what was right, regardless of the cost. The Queen's sorrow plant would remain a symbol of the garden's complex history, but Gerald Booth would be remembered as its heart and conscience, the man who refused to let beauty be corrupted by lies, even when those lies had been growing for 35 years. As Helen prepared to leave Rosewood Garden for the final time, she felt a sense of completion that was rare in her investigative work. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and the community was already beginning to heal and rebuild. The garden would survive this scandal, she was certain. Like all living things, it would adapt, grow, and find new ways to flourish. But it would do so with a deeper understanding of the responsibility that comes with tending something beautiful and powerful, and with the memory of Gerald Booth, standing guard against those who would corrupt that beauty for their own ends. Chapter 7. Thorns in the Spotlight. 3 weeks after Victor Bellamy's arrest, Rosewood Garden had found itself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. What began as a local scandal had captured national attention, with botanical journals, true crime podcasts, and even a documentary crew descending on the peaceful garden to tell the story of murder, botanical theft, and a 35-year cover-up. Helen had returned reluctantly, drawn back not by curiosity about the media circus, but by Ivy's urgent phone call about new developments that threatened to derail the garden's recovery. "It's gotten completely out of hand," Ivy said as she met Helen at the main entrance. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd been getting little sleep. The media attention was manageable at first, actually helpful for bringing in donations and support. But now we have conspiracy theorists, treasure hunters, and amateur botanists trampling through our flower beds looking for other hidden specimens and secret research facilities. Helen surveyed the scene with dismay. News vans lined the entrance road, and she could see camera crews positioned throughout the garden. Volunteers had been stationed at various points to prevent visitors from damaging plants or restricted areas, but they looked overwhelmed by the crowds. "And it gets worse," Ivy continued. 3 people have been hospitalized this week after attempting to extract their own samples from the Queen's sorrow plant. One woman brought pruning shears and tried to take cuttings. A man was found trying to brew tea from the petals he'd collected. "Good God," Helen murmured. "Have you considered removing the plant entirely?" The garden board met yesterday to discuss exactly that. But we're getting pressure from multiple sides. Botanists who want to preserve it for legitimate research. lawyers representing Victor who claim it's evidence in his case, and now a pharmaceutical company that says they have legal rights to the genetic material. Helen's blood chilled. What pharmaceutical company? Meridian Biosystems. They've filed papers claiming that Victor's original research agreement with them gives them ownership rights to any discoveries made from the Queen's Sorrow line. Ivy's voice was tight with frustration. Their lawyers showed up yesterday with a court order preventing us from destroying or removing the plant until their claim is resolved. This was exactly what Helen had feared, that Victor's criminal enterprise would continue to cause damage even after his arrest. She followed Ivy through the crowds toward the trial garden, noting the increased security measures that had been implemented. The Queen's Sorrow specimen was now surrounded by plexiglass barriers and monitored by 2 security guards around the clock. Has anyone from Meridian explained how they plan to proceed? Helen asked. Their representatives keep talking about completing Victor's important work and realizing the plant's medical potential. They seem to think they can distance themselves from the criminal aspects while still claiming the benefits. At the trial garden, Helen was appalled by what she saw. The previously serene space had been transformed into something resembling a crime scene exhibit. Signs explained the plant's history and Gerald's murder, while velvet ropes kept crowds at a distance. Vendors had set up nearby selling Queen's Sorrow merchandise, everything from t-shirts to botanical prints to allegedly authentic dried petals. This is obscene, Helen said quietly. It gets worse, Ivy replied, leading her to a nearby information booth. Look at this. She handed Helen a glossy brochure titled The Queen's Sorrow Mystery Tour, Explore the Dark Secrets of Rosewood Garden. The pamphlet promised visitors the chance to walk in a killer's footsteps and discover the hidden botanical weapons that lurk in plain sight. Helen felt sick. Gerald's memory was being commercialized, turned into entertainment for ghoulish tourists. Who's responsible for this? A local tour company. They started operating without our permission, bringing busloads of people and spreading all kinds of wild theories. They've turned Gerald's murder into a macabre attraction. Helen's anger was building, but before she could respond, they were approached by a woman in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase and clipboard. Ms. Radley? The woman said, extending a manicured hand. I'm Jennifer Hawthorne from Meridian Biosystems. I was hoping we could discuss the terms of our partnership moving forward. Ivy's expression hardened. We don't have a partnership. Your company is associated with a murderer. I understand your concerns, Hawthorne said smoothly, but Victor Bellamy's personal actions don't negate the legitimate scientific value of his research. Meridian has invested significant resources in developing applications for the compounds found in Queen's Sorrow. We're prepared to offer the garden a substantial licensing fee to continue that work under proper ethical oversight. Ethical oversight? Helen interjected. Your company was negotiating with a man who stole botanical materials and committed murder to protect his secret. Hawthorne's smile didn't waver. We had no knowledge of Mr. Bellamy's criminal activities. Our agreements were with his research foundation, which appeared to be a legitimate scientific organization. We're as shocked as anyone by these revelations. But not so shocked that you're backing away from the potential profits, Helen observed. The plant's medical applications could help thousands of people. It would be irresponsible to abandon that research because of one man's crimes. Ivy stepped forward. And it would be irresponsible to reward theft and murder by proceeding with commercialization. The Garden Board has voted unanimously to oppose any commercial development of Queen's Sorrow pending a full ethical review. Hawthorne's professional demeanor cracked slightly. I should remind you that we have legal standing in this matter. Our contract with Bellamy's Foundation gives us exclusive development rights to any compounds derived from his research. You cannot simply ignore valid legal agreements. We'll see about that, Helen said. Contracts based on stolen materials and fraudulent research tend not to hold up in court. After Hawthorne departed with obvious frustration, Helen and Ivy walked to a quieter section of the garden to discuss the situation. How strong is their legal position? Helen asked. Our lawyers say it's complicated. Victor did sign agreements with them, and he had some legitimate research credentials despite his criminal activities. The question is whether contracts based on stolen materials can be enforced. What does the garden board want to do? Ideally, destroy the plant and be done with it. But with the legal challenges and the media attention, we're trapped. Any action we take will be scrutinized and probably challenged in court. Helen considered the implications. The garden was being held hostage by the very secrets it was trying to leave behind. Victor's crimes continued to poison the community, even from his jail cell. There might be another way, she said slowly. What if we could prove that Meridian knew about Victor's criminal activities, that they were complicit in the theft and cover-up? Do you think that's possible? Corporate pharmaceutical development doesn't happen in a vacuum. If Victor was providing them with compounds extracted from a supposedly extinct plant, someone at Meridian had to ask questions about the source. That afternoon, Helen met with Sheriff Mike at his office to review the evidence seized from Victor's greenhouse. Among the business correspondence were dozens of emails and reports sent to Meridian over the past 2 years. "Look at this," Mike said, showing Helen a series of email exchanges. Victor was very specific about the proprietary nature of his source materials. He repeatedly emphasized that the plant variety was extremely rare and not available through normal botanical channels. Helen read through the correspondence, noting the increasingly suspicious nature of the communications. And look at Meridian's responses. They're asking detailed questions about acquisition methods and source verification. They knew something wasn't right. "Here's the smoking gun," Mike said, pulling out a particularly damning email. Victor explicitly states that his source materials come from a rescued specimen of an extinct variety, and that discretion is essential to protect proprietary interests. Meridian's response thanks him for his innovative approach to botanical sourcing. Helen whistled low. They knew he was working with stolen materials. This language is deliberately vague to provide plausible deniability, but the intent is clear. Will this be enough to invalidate their legal claims? It should be, and more importantly, it might open them up to criminal conspiracy charges. That evening, Helen joined Ivy and the garden board for an emergency meeting to discuss their options. The board members, a mix of botanists, community leaders, and local officials, looked haggard from weeks of dealing with media attention and legal challenges. "The situation has become untenable," announced Dr. Patricia Wells, the board chair. "We're spending more time dealing with lawyers, reporters, and corporate representatives than we are caring for the garden. Something has to change." Helen presented the evidence of Meridian's likely complicity, explaining how the email correspondence suggested they knew Victor was working with improperly acquired materials. "If we can prove they were willing participants in botanical theft, their legal claims become worthless," she concluded. "But more importantly, it sends a message that this kind of corporate behavior won't be tolerated." "What do you propose?" asked board member Thomas Chen. "We turn the evidence over to the FBI for investigation of corporate conspiracy. We also go public with what we've found, showing that Meridian wasn't an innocent victim, but a willing partner in Victor's scheme." The board voted unanimously to pursue this course of action. 3 days later, Helen watched from the garden's main pavilion as FBI agents served search warrants on Meridian Biosystems' corporate offices. The media circus that had been focused on Rosewood suddenly shifted its attention to the pharmaceutical giant and its role in the scandal. Within a week, Meridian had withdrawn its legal claims and issued a public apology, citing newly discovered information about our former partners' activities. 3 of their executives were indicted on conspiracy charges, and the company faced a federal investigation into its acquisition practices. The Queen's Sorrow plant, freed from legal limbo, was finally removed from public display. Following extensive community input, the garden board decided to maintain a single specimen in a secure research facility, available only to legitimate botanists working under strict ethical oversight. The tacky merchandise disappeared, the mystery tours were shut down by local authorities, and the media attention gradually shifted to other stories. Rosewood Garden, while forever changed by its ordeal, began to return to its essential purpose: providing a beautiful, peaceful space for people to connect with nature. Standing in the trial garden where Gerald had made his final stand for truth, Helen reflected on how the community had ultimately triumphed over those who would exploit tragedy for profit. It had taken time, determination, and the willingness to fight powerful interests, but justice had prevailed. Gerald would have been proud, she thought. His death had not been in vain if it led to stronger protections against the kind of corporate exploitation that had corrupted his beloved garden. As she prepared to leave Rosewood once again, Helen felt confident that this time, the garden would truly be able to heal and move forward. The truth had been fully exposed, the exploiters had been driven away, and the community had proven its resilience. The garden would bloom again, cleanly and honestly, just as Gerald had always intended. Chapter 8. A Garden Reclaimed. 6 months after Victor Bellamy's arrest, Helen returned to Rosewood Garden for what she hoped would be a purely pleasurable visit. The autumn air carried the scent of chrysanthemums and the last roses of the season, and the morning light had that crystalline quality that made every color seem more vivid. The transformation was remarkable. Gone were the news vans, the gawking crowds, and the tacky merchandise stands. In their place was the peaceful sanctuary that Gerald had spent his life protecting. Paths swept clean, flower beds carefully tended, and visitors moving with the quiet reverence appropriate to a place of beauty and contemplation. Helen found Ivy in the conservatory, overseeing the installation of a new educational display about ethical botanical research. Her auburn hair was longer now, and she moved with a confidence that spoke of someone who had weathered a serious crisis and emerged stronger. "Helen!" Ivy's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I was hoping you'd make it for the dedication ceremony. I wouldn't miss it. How are things?" "Better than I dared hope 6 months ago." Ivy gestured toward the conservatory's interior, where the old displays had been replaced with exhibits focusing on sustainable gardening practices and the history of botanical ethics. "We've rebuilt our entire educational program around Gerald's principles: transparency, community involvement, and respect for both the potential and the dangers of what we're growing." They walked together through the conservatory, Helen noting the subtle changes that reflected the garden's new priorities. Information placards now included detailed discussions of plant safety and ethical considerations. Interactive displays encouraged visitors to think critically about the relationship between scientific discovery and social responsibility. "What happened to the original Queen Sorrow specimen?" Helen asked. "It's in the university's secure research facility, available only to scientists working under strict oversight protocols. 3 different research teams have been approved to study its properties, but all under agreements that require community consent for any development work." "And Victor?" Ivy's expression darkened slightly. "He pled guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy charges. 15 years to life. The pharmaceutical executives got lighter sentences, 5 to 10 years for conspiracy and fraud." They emerged from the conservatory into the main garden area, where Helen could see preparations underway for some kind of ceremony. Volunteers were arranging chairs around a small platform, and someone was testing a microphone. "What's the occasion?" Helen asked. "The Gerald Booth Memorial Garden Dedication," Ivy explained. "We've created a new section of the garden focused on educational outreach and ethical research practices. There's also a memorial bench and a small meditation area." Helen felt a warmth in her chest. This was exactly the kind of tribute Gerald would have appreciated. Not a monument to tragedy, but a living commitment to the values he had died defending. As they walked toward the ceremony site, Helen noticed other positive changes. The volunteer staff seemed more engaged and purposeful. Visitors were asking thoughtful questions and participating in guided discussions about plant science and ethics. Children were learning not just about flowers and trees, but about the responsibility that comes with knowledge and power. "You've done remarkable work here," Helen told Ivy. "We all have. The whole community came together after the media circus died down. People realized that we had a choice. We could let this tragedy define us, or we could use it as an opportunity to become better." They paused at the site of the former trial garden, where the controversial Queen's Sorrow specimen had grown. In its place was a new planting of native wildflowers, with a simple marker reading, "In memory of those who seek truth in beauty and beauty in truth." "Margot's idea," Ivy explained. "She said Gerald would have preferred wildflowers to exotic hybrids anyway." Speaking of Margot, Helen spotted the older woman near the memorial site, directing the placement of flowers around a beautiful stone bench. She looked healthier than Helen had seen her in months. The stress lines around her eyes had softened, and she moved with renewed energy. "Margot!" Helen called. Margot turned with a bright smile. "Helen, how wonderful to see you. Come look at our memorial garden." The space was thoughtfully designed, not somber or mournful, but peaceful and inspiring. The central feature was indeed a stone bench carved with one of Gerald's favorite quotes, "A garden requires patient labor and attention. Friends, I give you my attention." Around it grew a carefully curated selection of plants that Gerald had particularly loved: native ferns, heritage roses, aromatic herbs, and flowering shrubs that attracted beneficial insects. "It's perfect," Helen said sincerely. "He would have loved this." "We hope so." We also established the Gerald Booth Fellowship for Ethical Botanical Research. The first recipient is a graduate student studying sustainable plant breeding methods. The dedication ceremony began at 11 o'clock with a surprisingly large crowd in attendance. Helen recognized many faces from the festival and the subsequent investigation. Clarice was there, now serving on the garden's ethics advisory board. Sheriff Mike had come with his parents. Even some of the volunteers who had been working during that fateful week had returned for the occasion. The speakers included Ivy, Margot, the mayor, and a representative from the State Botanical Society. But the most moving tribute came from an unexpected source: Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the graduate student who had received the first Gerald Booth Fellowship. "I never met Gerald Booth," she began, "but his legacy has shaped my entire approach to botanical research. In my laboratory, I keep a photo of him working in this garden, and whenever I face a difficult ethical decision, I ask myself, what would Gerald do? The answer is always the same: choose transparency over secrecy, community benefit over personal gain, and truth over convenience." After the formal ceremony, Helen walked the garden paths with Shadow and Halo, both dogs showing signs of contentment at returning to a place that now felt peaceful rather than troubled. The autumn plantings were at their peak, asters and goldenrod providing late-season color, ornamental grasses swaying in the breeze, and the last roses of the year glowing in the afternoon sun. She paused at various spots that held memories from the investigation: the conservatory where Gerald had died, the archive building where so many secrets had been revealed, the fountain where crucial evidence had been hidden. But these places no longer felt haunted. They had been reclaimed by the living, transformed from crime scenes into integral parts of a garden dedicated to growth, learning, and ethical stewardship. Near the old greenhouse site, Helen encountered Clarice working on a new art installation, a sculpture made from reclaimed materials that celebrated the relationship between human creativity and natural beauty. "It's called symbiosis," Clarice explained, gesturing to the intertwining metal forms that seemed to grow organically from the earth. "It represents the idea that humans and nature can work together constructively when there's mutual respect and understanding." "What happened to your competitive botanical sculpture?" Clarice smiled ruefully. "I donated it to a museum as part of an exhibit on art and ethics. Seemed appropriate given its role in the investigation." "And your grandmother's research?" "It's been properly archived and credited. Several botanical institutions have reached out about collaborating on new projects based on her work, but this time with full ethical oversight and community involvement." Helen could see the peace in Clarice's face, the satisfaction of having finally achieved justice for her grandmother's legacy through legitimate means rather than the misguided revenge she had initially contemplated. As the afternoon wore on, Helen found herself in conversation with various community members about the garden's future. The consensus was remarkable. People understood that they had been through something traumatic, but transformative. The experience of confronting corruption and exploitation had strengthened their commitment to the values that made the garden special. "We're stronger now," one volunteer told her. "We know what we stand for, and we're not afraid to defend it." That evening, Helen attended a small dinner hosted by Ivy for the key figures who had helped navigate the crisis. The gathering was held in the garden's old meeting hall, now refurbished and renamed the Gerald Booth Community Center. The conversation was lively and forward-looking. Margot talked about new educational programs that would teach visitors about plant science and ethics. Ivy described partnerships with universities that would bring legitimate research to the garden under transparent community oversight. Clarice discussed plans for an annual art festival celebrating the relationship between creativity and environmental stewardship. "What about you, Helen?" Ivy asked. "Any thoughts on what we should do next?" Helen considered the question. "I think you should continue doing exactly what you're doing, honoring Gerald's memory by living his values. The best memorial to someone like Gerald isn't a statue or a plaque, it's a community that embodies the principles he died defending." As the evening wound down, Helen stepped outside onto the garden's main terrace. The night air was cool and clear, carrying the scent of late-blooming roses and the promise of seasonal change. In the distance, she could see the lights of the memorial garden, where solar-powered fixtures provided gentle illumination for evening visitors. She thought about Gerald, about the man who had given his life rather than compromise his principles. His death had been tragic, but his legacy was thriving. The garden he had loved was not only surviving, but growing stronger, more ethical, more connected to its community. Shadow pressed against her leg, and Halo sat attentively at her side. Both dogs seemed to sense the significance of the moment, the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. "Ready to go home, boys?" she asked softly. But as she prepared to leave, Helen realized that in some sense, Rosewood Garden would always be home to a part of her. She had helped save it from those who would exploit its beauty for profit, and in doing so she had become part of its ongoing story. The garden would continue to bloom, season after season, year after year, and somewhere among its flowers and trees would be the enduring spirit of Gerald Booth, the man who had taught them all that true beauty requires both courage and conscience to protect. As Helen walked back to her car, she could hear the gentle sounds of the garden settling into evening, the rustle of leaves, the soft hum of beneficial insects, the whisper of wind through the memorial plantings. It was the sound of life continuing, of growth and renewal, of a community that had learned to tend its treasures with wisdom and care. Gerald's garden was safe, and that, Helen thought with deep satisfaction, was the best possible ending to a story that had begun with such darkness and pain. Chapter 9: Shadows and Sunlight. Helen unlocked her front door and was met by the comforting scent of lemon balm and honey. The house was still and quiet, exactly what she needed after the emotional intensity of the memorial dedication. Halo bounded in first, did a sweeping patrol of the living room, and immediately collapsed into his favorite patch of sun near the hearth. Shadow trotted in behind him, tail high, but paused to nuzzle Helen's leg before curling up by the bay window. They were home. After months of intermittent visits to Rosewood Garden, the stillness of her little cottage felt like a balm. No more whispers of conspiracy, no more corporate lawyers or media vultures circling like carrion birds over tragedy. Just polished wood floors, the faint creak of her favorite wicker chair, and the gentle clink of her kettle settling on the stovetop. She moved through the kitchen slowly, reacquainting herself with the familiar rhythms of her private life. Earl Grey tea with a touch of bergamot. A slice of apple cinnamon bread from May's latest baking experiment. The dogs watching her every move with contented interest, as if reassuring themselves that this time she really was staying home. The past year had changed her in ways she was still discovering. Gerald's death had affected her more deeply than she'd initially realized. Not just the loss of a good man, but the recognition of how easily corruption could take root even in the most beautiful places. The investigation had revealed layers of deception going back decades, but it had also shown her the power of a community united in defense of its values. She carried her tea into the sitting room and reached for the stack of mail that had accumulated during her most recent trip to Rosewood. Among the usual bills and catalogs was a thick envelope bearing the garden's logo, the final report from the ethics committee that had been established in Gerald's memory. The document was impressive in its thoroughness. The committee had spent 6 months reviewing every aspect of the garden's operations, from research protocols to donor relationships to educational programming. Their recommendations were comprehensive and forward-thinking, establishing safeguards that would prevent another Victor Bellamy from exploiting the garden's resources. But what touched Helen most were the personal testimonials included in the appendix. Letters from visitors, volunteers, and community members describing how the garden's transformation had inspired them to examine ethics in their own lives and work. A local teacher had redesigned her science curriculum to emphasize ethical decision-making. A businessman had implemented new transparency policies in his company. A group of high school students had started an environmental ethics club. Gerald's influence was rippling outward in ways he never could have imagined. Helen set the report aside and walked to her kitchen window, which looked out over her own small garden. The autumn plantings were past their peak, but still beautiful. Purple asters nodding in the breeze, ornamental grasses catching the last light of day, a few hardy roses clinging to their final blooms. She thought about the irony of it all. She had gone to Rosewood expecting nothing more challenging than admiring flowers and catching up with an old friend. Instead, she had uncovered a murder, exposed a decades-old conspiracy, and helped a community reclaim its soul from those who would exploit it. The phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. May's voice was warm and familiar on the other end. "Welcome home, stranger. How was the dedication?" "Perfect," Helen said, settling into her favorite chair. "Gerald would have been proud. They've created something beautiful and meaningful. Not just a memorial, but a living commitment to the principles he died defending. And how are you?" "Really?" Helen considered the question. Tired but satisfied. It feels like this case is finally, truly closed. Not just the criminal investigation, but the healing process that had to follow. "Good. You've been carrying that weight for months. Time to let it go." "I think I'm ready to..." They chatted for a while about lighter topics. May's latest baking experiments, the changing seasons, plans for the upcoming holidays. Normal, peaceful conversation that reminded Helen why she valued her quiet life in this small community. After hanging up, she returned to her garden to do some late-season cleanup. The physical work felt therapeutic, pulling spent annuals, cutting back perennials, preparing the beds for winter's rest. As she worked, she reflected on the lessons the Rosewood case had taught her. The most important lesson was about the fragility of trust and the vigilance required to protect it. Victor Bellamy had been a respected member of the community for decades, his reputation built on charitable donations and civic involvement. But underneath that veneer of respectability, he had been systematically exploiting the very institutions he claimed to support. The second lesson was about the power of collective action. Individual voices, Gerald's warnings, Clarice's research, Margot's growing suspicions, had been dismissed or suppressed. But when the community came together, united by shared values and common purpose, they had been able to expose the truth and create lasting change. The third lesson was about the importance of moral courage. Gerald could have looked the other way, could have chosen the safer path of silence and willful ignorance. Instead, he had risked everything to protect the integrity of something he loved. His sacrifice had not been in vain. As evening approached, Helen found herself at the small memorial garden she had created in her own backyard. A quiet corner dedicated to cases that had touched her deeply, and people whose lives had intersected with hers in meaningful ways. She added a new stone to the collection, one she had brought from Rosewood Garden, and spoke Gerald's name aloud. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for showing us what it means to choose principle over convenience, truth over comfort, community over personal gain." Shadow appeared at her side, as if sensing the solemnity of the moment. Halo lay down nearby, his presence a warm comfort in the gathering dusk. Helen remained in the memorial garden until the first stars appeared, thinking about the strange journey that had brought her from a simple garden festival to the center of a complex web of murder, corruption, and redemption. She had solved the mystery, seen justice done, and helped a community heal. But more than that, she had been reminded of why her work mattered, not just the solving of crimes, but the protection of truth and the defense of those who could not defend themselves. As she prepared to go inside, Helen felt a familiar stirring, the subtle awareness that another mystery might be waiting somewhere in the shadows. It was a feeling she had learned to trust over the years, an intuition that told her when her particular skills might be needed. But for now, she was content to rest in the satisfaction of a case well closed and a community well served. Gerald Booth's legacy was secure. Rosewood Garden was thriving under ethical leadership, and the truth had prevailed over corruption and greed. Helen gathered her gardening tools and headed inside, followed by her faithful canine companions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries, new opportunities to stand for justice and truth. But tonight, she would rest in the peace of her own garden, surrounded by the simple beauty of growing things and the quiet satisfaction of duty well done. As she turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, Helen smiled at the thought of Gerald tending to his beloved roses in whatever realm awaited gardeners after their earthly work was done. She hoped he knew that his garden and the values he had died protecting were in good hands. The house settled into comfortable silence, 2 dogs breathing softly in their chosen spots, and outside, the autumn wind whispered through the trees like a benediction. Helen drifted off to sleep, knowing that some stories, no matter how they begin, can have truly happy endings. And in the morning, there would always be something new waiting to bloom. Chapter 10, Restoring Rosewood. 2 years after Gerald Booth's murder, Helen returned to Rosewood Garden for what had become an annual pilgrimage, the Gerald Booth Memorial Lecture, an event that had grown from a simple community gathering into a nationally recognized symposium on botanical ethics and community stewardship. The spring morning was glorious, with dogwoods in full bloom and the garden's famous roses beginning their seasonal display. As Helen walked the familiar paths with shadow and halo, she marveled at the transformation that had taken place. The garden had not merely survived its ordeal, it had evolved into something richer and more meaningful than it had ever been before. The changes were visible everywhere. New educational pavilions hosted workshops on sustainable gardening and plant ethics. Research greenhouses operated under glass walls, literally transparent to ensure accountability and community oversight. The visitor center featured interactive exhibits that told the complete story of the garden's history, including the dark chapter of corruption and murder that had nearly destroyed it. But perhaps most importantly, the garden buzzed with the energy of genuine community engagement. Volunteers weren't just tending flower beds, they were participating in research projects, leading educational tours, and helping to develop policies that would govern the garden's future. The institution, that had once been vulnerable to exploitation by a single powerful individual, had become truly community-owned and community-directed. Helen found Ivy in the newly expanded archive building, which had been renamed the Gerald Booth Center for Botanical Research and Ethics. The space was 3 times its original size, with climate-controlled storage for historical documents, modern research facilities for visiting scholars, and a public reading room where anyone could access the garden's complete records. "Helen!" Ivy embraced her warmly. "Perfect timing. I wanted to show you something before the lecture begins." She led Helen to a display case containing a collection of documents, the original research notes for Queen Sorrow, Clarice's grandmother's botanical illustrations, correspondence between early researchers, and photographs documenting the hybrid's development from conception to near extinction to eventual ethical preservation. "We call it the Transparency Archive," Ivy explained. "Everything related to controversial research is displayed publicly, with full documentation of decisions made and reasons behind them. No more secrets, no more hidden agendas." Helen studied the display, noting how the presentation balanced scientific achievement with honest acknowledgement of ethical failures. This is exactly what Gerald would have wanted. We think so too, and it's been incredibly effective. 3 universities have approached us about establishing satellite research programs here, specifically because of our transparency protocols. They walked together toward the lecture amphitheater, a new outdoor facility constructed in a grove of oak trees near Gerald's memorial garden. The seating was designed to blend naturally with the landscape, and the stage featured a living backdrop of native plants and heritage roses. "Tell me about this year's speaker," Helen said. Dr. Sarah Chen from the National Institute of Health. She's presenting on community consent in botanical research, essentially how to ensure that communities have meaningful input into research that affects them. Ivy's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Her work was directly inspired by what happened here. She calls it the Rosewood model. As they approached the amphitheater, Helen was struck by the diversity of the gathering crowd. She saw researchers from major universities, representatives from botanical gardens across the country, graduate students, local community members, and even some of the original festival participants from 2 years ago. Margot appeared at Helen's elbow, looking vibrant and purposeful. Her role had evolved from archive manager to director of community engagement, and she seemed to thrive in the position. "Helen, wonderful to see you. I have someone I'd like you to meet." She gestured toward a young woman with a notebook and an earnest expression. "This is Dr. Lisa Park. She's writing her dissertation on botanical crime. Apparently, our case has spawned an entire academic subfield." Dr. Park's handshake was firm, and her questions were intelligent. "Ms. Lighthall, I've been studying the investigative methods you used here. Your approach of combining traditional detective work with community knowledge and botanical expertise seems to have created a new model for solving complex institutional crimes." Helen smiled wryly. "I was just trying to find out who killed Gerald. I didn't realize I was pioneering anything." "But that's exactly the point," Dr. Park continued enthusiastically. "You didn't impose an external investigative framework. You worked within the community's existing relationships and knowledge systems. That's what made it possible to uncover not just the immediate crime, but the systemic corruption that enabled it." Before Helen could respond, she spotted a familiar figure near the memorial garden. Clarice, now serving as the garden's artist-in-residence, tending to a new sculpture installation. Helen excused herself and walked over to admire the work. The piece was called Growth Rings and consisted of concentric circles of different materials: stone for the foundation, metal for strength, glass for transparency, and living vines that would grow and change over time. A plaque explained that it represented the garden's evolution from secrecy through crisis to transparent renewal. "It's beautiful," Helen said sincerely. Clarice looked up from her weeding, her face serene in a way that Helen hadn't seen during their first meeting. "Thank you. I wanted to create something that would evolve over time, just like the garden itself. Each year the living elements will change, but the foundation remains solid." "How do you feel about everything now? Having your grandmother's work finally recognized?" "Grateful. But more than that, I feel like I understand her better now. She wasn't just trying to create a beautiful flower. She was trying to contribute to human knowledge in a way that would help people. The tragedy wasn't that her work was suppressed, but that it was corrupted for selfish purposes." They were interrupted by the sound of the lecture beginning. Dr. Chen's presentation was compelling, using the Rosewood case as a framework for discussing how botanical research could be conducted ethically with full community involvement. She spoke about informed consent, benefit sharing, and the importance of transparent governance in preventing exploitation. The Rosewood model shows us that community oversight isn't an obstacle to scientific progress. It's a prerequisite for ethical progress, Dr. Chen concluded. When research is conducted in partnership with communities rather than imposed upon them, the results are both more scientifically valid and more socially beneficial. The applause was enthusiastic, and the Q&A session that followed was lively and thoughtful. Helen found herself impressed by the sophistication of the questions from community members, who had clearly become knowledgeable partners in the garden's research activities. After the lecture, Helen joined a smaller gathering at the Memorial Garden for a more intimate conversation about Gerald's legacy. The group included longtime volunteers, researchers, and community leaders who had all been shaped by the events of 2 years ago. "I think Gerald would be amazed by what's grown from his sacrifice," said Mrs. Patterson, an elderly volunteer who had worked with Gerald for decades. "He always believed that sunshine was the best disinfectant, but I don't think he could have imagined how beautiful transparency could be." Sheriff Mike, now retired but still closely connected to the garden community, raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To Gerald Booth, who taught us that the most dangerous secrets are the ones we keep from ourselves." As the afternoon wore on, Helen found herself in conversation with Dr. Chen about the broader implications of the Rosewood case. "What's interesting," Dr. Chen observed, "is how the crisis forced the community to articulate values they had always held but never explicitly stated. The corruption succeeded initially because it masqueraded as business as usual. But once people understood what was at stake, they found they had more power than they realized." "Do you think this model could work in other contexts?" Helen asked. "I think it has to. The alternative is more Victor Bellamy's, people who exploit the gaps between institutional power and community oversight. The Rosewood model shows that those gaps can be closed, but only through deliberate effort and constant vigilance." As evening approached, Helen walked once more through the garden, taking in the sights and sounds of a community that had transformed trauma into strength. Children played in the educational playground, designed to teach botanical concepts through interactive exhibits. Couples strolled hand in hand along paths lined with heritage roses and native wildflowers. Researchers worked in glass-walled laboratories, where their activities were visible to any curious visitor. At the heart of it all was Gerald's Memorial Garden, now expanded to include not just remembrance, but active celebration of the values he had embodied. The space hosted regular community meetings, educational workshops, and quiet reflection. It was a living reminder that individual courage could inspire collective transformation. Helen paused at Gerald's memorial bench, where someone had left a fresh bouquet of Queen's sorrow blooms, no longer a symbol of hidden danger, but of potential realized through ethical stewardship. The plant was now being developed through a collaborative research program involving the garden, 3 universities, and a community oversight board. Early results suggested it might indeed have valuable medical applications, but any development would proceed slowly, transparently, and with full community consent. As she prepared to leave, Helen reflected on how the case had changed her own understanding of justice. Solving Gerald's murder had been important, but the real victory was in what came after: the painstaking work of building systems that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. The garden would face new challenges, she was certain. There would always be people who tried to exploit beautiful things for ugly purposes, but now the community was prepared for such threats. They had learned to recognize the warning signs of corruption, to ask difficult questions, and to stand together in defense of their shared values. Shadow and Halo trotted beside her as she walked back to her car, their tails wagging with the satisfaction of dogs who had spent a perfect day in their favorite place. As Helen drove away, she could see the garden's lights twinkling in her rearview mirror, not the harsh glare of media attention or crime scene investigation, but the warm glow of a community gathering in celebration of life, growth, and the eternal possibility of renewal. Gerald's garden was not just safe, it was thriving. And that, Helen thought with deep contentment, was the most beautiful thing of all. Epilogue. 5 years later, on a soft summer morning that carried the promise of another perfect day, Helen stood in her own cottage garden with a steaming mug of coffee and yesterday's mail. Among the usual collection of catalogs and bills was an envelope that made her smile. Cream-colored paper with the elegant Rosewood Garden logo, postmarked 3 days earlier. Inside was a wedding invitation. Ivy Radley and Dr. Marcus Webb request the pleasure of your company at their marriage ceremony, to be held in the Gerald Booth Memorial Garden at Rosewood, followed by a reception in the Heritage Rose Pavilion. Helen chuckled softly, remembering Ivy's transformation from the harried festival organizer she'd first met to the confident director who had rebuilt Rosewood into a model of ethical botanical research. Dr. Webb was a visiting scholar who had come to study the garden's community engagement model and had apparently been charmed by more than just the institutional innovations. A second page contained a handwritten note in Ivy's familiar script. "Helen, I hope you can join us for this celebration. Marcus and I met during one of the Gerald Booth Memorial Lectures, bonding over our shared belief that the most beautiful discoveries happen when brilliant minds work together in trust and transparency. The garden has taught us both that the strongest foundations are built on honesty, community, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. We can't imagine celebrating anywhere else, and we can't imagine celebrating without the woman who helped make it all possible. Please say yes. All our love, Ivy." P.S. Margot insists on doing the flowers, and Clarice is designing a special installation for the ceremony. Shadow and Halo are specifically invited. Marcus is a dog person, too. Helen folded the invitation carefully and tucked it into her kitchen drawer beside other treasured correspondence from Rosewood. Over the years, she had received updates on the garden's continued success, research partnerships with universities around the world, the establishment of an endowment fund that ensured Gerald's memorial would be maintained in perpetuity, and the publication of academic papers that cited the Rosewood model as a breakthrough in community-based scientific ethics. But more than the institutional successes, she treasured the personal notes. Margot's annual Christmas cards with photos of her grandchildren playing in the educational gardens, Clarice's postcards from gallery openings where her botanical sculptures were now exhibited internationally, and Sheriff Mike's retirement announcement that mentioned how the Rosewood case had been the most meaningful of his career. Helen walked to her kitchen window and looked out at her own small garden, where the morning light was painting everything in shades of gold and green. Her cottage garden had grown more sophisticated over the years, influenced by her experiences at Rosewood and her growing understanding of the relationship between beauty and responsibility. She had planted heritage roses near the kitchen window, not Queen Sorrow, which remained under careful cultivation at the university research facility, but varieties with their own stories of perseverance and renewal. Beside them grew herbs that she used for cooking and tea, vegetables that fed her modest household, and flowers that attracted beneficial insects and provided simple joy. It was a working garden, productive and purposeful, but also beautiful in its own quiet way. Like Rosewood itself, it had evolved to embody the principles she had learned through investigation and experience: transparency in her methods, sustainability in her practices, and generous sharing of whatever abundance it produced. Shadow appeared at her side, now gray around the muzzle, but still alert and devoted. Halo had passed away the previous winter, peacefully in his sleep, after a long and contented life. Helen had buried him in the memorial corner of her garden, next to other beloved companions whose lives had enriched her own. The loss had been difficult, but it had also reminded her of something Gerald's death had taught her, that the measure of a life wasn't its length but its impact, not what someone accumulated but what they contributed to the world's store of beauty, truth, and compassion. She finished her coffee and began her morning routine of tending to the plants that depended on her care. As she worked, Helen reflected on the strange turns her life had taken since that first visit to Rosewood Garden. She had gone expecting nothing more challenging than admiring flowers and catching up with an old friend. Instead, she had uncovered murder, exposed corruption, and helped a community reclaim its soul. But perhaps most importantly, she had been reminded of why her work mattered. Solving crimes wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about protecting the things that made life worth living. Gardens and communities, truth and beauty, the bonds of trust that allowed people to create something larger than themselves. The phone rang as she was deadheading the last of the spring roses. May's voice was as warm and familiar as ever. "Good morning, Detective. What's on your agenda today?" "Just gardening," Helen replied. "Though I did get a wedding invitation from Rosewood. Ivy's getting married in the memorial garden." "How lovely! Will you go?" Helen considered the question, looking out at her own peaceful garden where bees hummed among the lavender and a pair of cardinals had built their nest in the climbing roses. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I will. It's time to see how the story ends." "Ends?" May laughed. "Helen Lighthall, you of all people should know that the best stories never really end. They just keep blooming season after season." After they hung up, Helen remained in her garden, enjoying the simple pleasure of watching things grow. May was right, of course. The story that had begun with Gerald's murder hadn't ended with Victor's conviction, or even with Rosewood's transformation. It continued every day in the choices people made about how to treat each other and the beautiful, fragile world they shared. In a few weeks, she would return to Rosewood for Ivy's wedding, and she would see the latest chapter in the garden's ongoing story of renewal and growth. There would be new faces and new challenges, but also the enduring commitment to the values that Gerald had died defending. And then she would come home to her own garden, to Shadow's faithful companionship and the quiet satisfaction of tending growing things. There would be other mysteries, other communities in need of her particular blend of intuition and persistence. But there would also be mornings like this one, when the world seemed perfectly balanced between beauty and purpose, growth and rest, solitude and connection. Helen smiled and called Shadow to her side. Together, they walked the garden paths in comfortable silence, two old friends grateful for another day in paradise, a paradise they had helped to preserve, protect, and share with anyone wise enough to recognize its value. In the distance, church bells began to chime the hour, their music mingling with the songs of birds and the gentle whisper of wind through the leaves. It was the sound of life continuing, of communities gathering, of time moving forward while honoring what came before. Helen's garden bloomed around her in all its humble glory, and somewhere beyond her small corner of the world, Gerald's garden continued its own magnificent flowering, a testament to the truth that beauty, tended with wisdom and protected with courage, could indeed bloom eternal. The end.